All right, so this week we are beginning with a look at what our textbook calls Indigenous Sacred Ways. And so this would apply to kind of indigenous peoples all over the globe. I mean, there's many ways we could look at this particular sliver of living religions, look at Native American beliefs, indigenous peoples of the Amazon, tribal peoples on the African continent. There's many ways we could go. Today, what we're going to do, as I think I mentioned in our previous lectures, we're going to zero in on Australian Aboriginal culture as our what we call our test case for looking at tribal religions, and kind of getting into the details as a way, again, not just to simply reiterate what the book is giving you, but to take a piece of what's from the textbook and to go into greater detail. And I think that's what gives lectures like these their use. But before we get to the Australian Aborigines, just a slide here to cover what do we mean by indigenous sacred ways? What are their core elements? What might a tribal culture like Native American cultures in North America, what might they have in common with Australian Aboriginal peoples? And what we do find, and what scholars and academics have found comparing these peoples all around the world, is that they indeed do share a similar kind of worldview, a similar kind of notion of the divine, similar types of initiation ceremonies, as we'll see. So, what are we talking about here? We are talking about, sorry, come on, traditional pre-industrial cultures. So these are cultures like the ones that I mentioned that really, in many ways, have separated themselves or not become part of kind of technological revolutions. Certainly not part of what we might deem as the Western world. What we find in these cultures is, in their beliefs, no separation between the sacred and the secular. In fact, these categories don't even exist. You might say kind of everything is sacred in indigenous tribal beliefs to a degree. I mean, the idea of kind of the secular, kind of the humanist view as separate from the sacred, is really more of kind of a Western idea that does not belong to these cultures. Tribal peoples tend to believe that they have a sacred kinship to all living and non-living things. There is no hierarchy of importance. That is, human beings are not more important than any other part of nature. Human beings are kind of integral to nature, but they are just kind of part of this larger kind of sacred being, as it were. Whereas you find, as we'll see, like in the monotheistic religions, they tend to put kind of human beings at the top of the pyramid, at the top of the most important part of creation, and then things filter down from there. Not so in tribal religions. Natural world is pervaded by thinking, living presences. This idea that not only is the earth sacred, but every part of it is alive with a sanctity, with a spirit, and that would include what we would, in kind of Western categories, call the inanimate. Rocks, dirt, water is just as pervaded by a spiritual presence as are humans and animals. Elements in nature contain spirits which inspire fear and awe. It's kind of a subset of this one here. Maybe certain we'll see certain places in nature are more spiritually charged than others. As we'll look at, actually, the land mass that you see in the background, we'll get to in just a moment, is a particularly important one for Australian Aboriginal beliefs. Loose notions of past, present, and future. All things seem to exist as an eternal present. I think this is a key thing. The the various religions we'll look at tend to have different concepts of time. As we'll see, monotheistic religions tend to have a much more kind of linear concept of time. There is a clear beginning. God created the world, and God will bring it time to an end. Eastern religions, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and the like, tend to have a much more kind of circular view of time. Is that there's no real beginning, there's no real end, like a circle. You're just kind of somewhere on the circuit. And indigenous peoples tend to, I would say, reject a kind of Western concept of time. If you think about our our division of time, 365 days in a year. We've decided that a year is, one trip of the Earth around the sun. We've divided up our year into weeks that are 7 days. We've come to some agreement that how long a second is. But if you just step back a moment, you realize just how much of a construct those things are. There's nothing natural or obvious, perhaps, about these things. Well, yeah, I don't know. But the kind of the concept of time and measuring time is a very much a human construct and category. And tribal peoples tend to not buy into that, so to speak. And so we'll see that for the Aboriginal peoples, the past, present, future, even those categories of time, they don't have language that really expresses that, and so they kind of everything what we would call the past, present, and future all exists as a kind of eternal present. It's very difficult to wrap kind of the Western logical, kind of post-Greek mind around these kinds of things. Now, the Australian Aboriginal religion, I mean, this is in some ways I'm doing a disservice here, because anytime you talk about a huge swath of people in which there are many tribes represented, you're always going to leave specifics out, and so I just want to call attention to that at the beginning here. So there are various tribes, Aboriginal peoples in Australia, but one of the things they do seem to share is this sacred narrative that we've kind of translated into this term dream time, or sometimes it's called simply the dreaming. And I do not pretend to understand it. I don't think anybody can really pin this down and kind of break this down according to Western logical categories. It's one of these things that, by definition, it defies logical categories, and that's one of the things that makes it so interesting to my mind. I'll do my best to kind of give some comparative examples that might help us understand this. But this idea of the dreaming or dream time is something that is distinctive about Australian Aboriginal peoples. No canonical or even semi-canonical scriptures to a degree. The way they do have their traditional stories, they have their legends, they have their sacred mythologies, you might say. But these are kept alive through oral traditions, passed down from generation to generation, from mouth to ear, from mouth to ear. Despite kind of this notion of no kind of hard concept of time, they do have creation stories with various mythic creatures responsible for creating aspects of the physical world, but not pinpointed on kind of a graph of time, you might say. Landforms are the direct results of a creator's actions. There is a place for gods. There is a place for sacred creatures in this, in these amongst these peoples, but it's not kind of the hard and fast definition you might find in like the pantheon of Greek mythology, as it were. It's a much different, slipperier kind of thing. And the most obvious example of kind of landforms that are sacred is this this rock that you see in the backslide here, which the Aboriginal peoples call Uluru, and what kind of the Western populations in Australia call Ayers Rock. So Ayers Rock here, you see a map of the continent slash country of Australia today. Ayers Rock is right at the dead center, more or less, of the continent, and I don't think that's unimportant. There's kind of this notion that the rock is almost like the belly button of the continent. It's the heart, you might say, of the continent, and it's even suggested by its geographical location. So here it is, and one of the reasons I bring it up is because it's not just because it's an important sacred entity to Aboriginal peoples, but it's also become the center of kind of this clash between Aboriginal tribal peoples and kind of the Western Europeanized population of Australia. As I'm sure most of you know, Australia today as a country is a country that was long settled by Great Britain, the United Kingdom. And so its population on the coasts tends to be of European descent, white, you might say, and the interior of the country, which you see here, kind of which is the geographical mass of the country, what we call the outback, not very hospitable to mass populations or Western civilization, you might call, is made up of Aboriginal peoples. Although they do, you find Aboriginal peoples in the main cities of Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth, and the like too. And Australia has had a lot of the same kinds of struggles that the United States has had. Our country too is a country with colonial roots in its present form, right? Founded by Britain, and through the Revolution broke off, became its own country. But there are of course people living here, the Native American tribes, and Australia, like America, has um, a uncomfortable, violent, often violent, um, clashing history with those tribal peoples. And just like here in the United States, it's not over. It's never really been dealt with. Same thing goes on in Australia. And Uluru here, or Ayers Rock, is one of the examples where this can come to a clash. Even its name. What do you even call it? The Aboriginal peoples have kind of, recognized the rock as sacred, have called it the Uluru for generations before, the settlers, colonial settlers, ever arrived. But it was, quote unquote, discovered by the colonial peoples and given the name, given a British name, Ayers Rock. And so there was a similar kind of thing that happened with Denali, the largest mountain in North America, which is in Alaska today. Denali is its tribal name, but it was named after President McKinley after he was assassinated in, I think, in the year 1900. And to honor him, they named Denali Mount McKinley. And that's what its official kind of Western name was until fairly recently, until the Alaskan people voted to make its official name, its original name, you might call it, Denali. Same thing here. What do we call it? Uluru, Ayers Rock. Who gets to decide what the rock is? And so, the rock itself, it certainly is. It's a tourist attraction. Many people who travel to Australia and want kind of an outback experience will go out there to see the rock. It's invariably described as the heart or the soul of Australia. Geologists say that it's, as a formation, it's about 300 million years old, so deeply, deeply ancient, way, way before any kind of human civilization. Stands 348 feet high. But as I was talking about, it's become the epicenter of this clash of cultures. How do you see the rock? How do you even interpret the rock? The Aboriginal, or what we might call the non-anthropocentric view, that is the non-human centered view, says the rock has its own particular identity and is innately sacred. It doesn't matter from an Aboriginal point of view what human beings think about the rock. It's sacred. It is what it is, and it's been sacred for millions and millions and millions of years before human beings ever came around. And so, what human beings think of the rock to the Aboriginal peoples is it's almost a non-starter. It's sacred by by the sheer fact of its existence. The more Western, kind of more anthropocentric, the more kind of coastal colonial view of the rock, it says, well, no, the rock is only important in as much as humans value it. And so without human appreciation, it would just simply be another inanimate object. And so from the Western point of view, let me just kind of go back to that main picture here, right here. It's extraordinary. It's a very dramatic thing, right? It juts up out of the outback plain here. It's orange, reddish hue, gives it a kind of ethereal beauty. This photograph has the sun coming up over it. And so from the Western point of view is that it's only important as much as humans find it beautiful and want to see it and want to touch it and want to photograph it and want to climb it. And the Aboriginal people say, no, that ultimately doesn't matter. And so to make this even more detailed here, there are on the sides of Ayers Rock, or Uluru, you see a detail here. These kind of carving outs, these eroded elements, which a Western geologist would say, well, where did these come from? Well, the ravages of wind, weather, and dust and dirt and rocks being blown around over time. They kind of carve out these patterns on the side of the rocks. But the Aboriginal people say, they call them the Iwara. He says, no, these are the footprints of our ancestors in some kind of ethereal, mystical, dreamtime kind of way. They are the fingerprints of those of the spirit world of what we would call their ancestors, and so this is evidence of the sanctity of the rock. Where a Western point of view would look at it perhaps more scientifically and say, well, no, we can explain that with geology. And so there was this controversy that erupted. I really only noticed it kind of popping over the last decade. Is do we how do we view the rock? Who owns the rock? And so, for a long time, tourists would come, drive from the big cities to the center of Australia, and you can see kind of the big tour buses here and all the cars. And of course, what lots of tourists wanted to do was to climb up the rock, and it was a great moneymaker, and it was a great tourist attraction. And so, what the companies did is they pounded these poles and attached a chain, took you up to the rock to kind of assist you on your steep but manageable climb to the top of the rock, and there you can get the great view and take your photographs. But this was, of course, deeply offensive and very insensitive to the Aboriginal peoples, who said, "No, this rock is sacred. It's the heart of a spiritual heart of our culture, and to pound these posts and loop these chains is a horrible thing to do." And so there was this very controversy. What do we do with the rock? I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I think as of this year, as of 2020, um, they no longer allow people to climb the rock. They've struck some compromise. They still allow the tour bus to go out there. You can walk around it. You can photograph it. But the rock itself is now, you stay off it, hands off, feet off, as it were. But that controversy, kind of that Western view versus Aboriginal view, Indigenous people versus colonial people, those struggles are always going to ebb and flow in their unique kinds of ways. All right, now this business of dream time, like a thing that I don't claim to be able to kind of explain in any kind of logical way, and I think it's a good thing to kind of leave it mysterious, because I think that's the best way to see it. So Indigenous Australian beliefs, Aboriginal beliefs, are what we would call animist. That is kind of everything in the world is imbued with a soul, a spirit. And animus, Animus in Latin, is a soul or a spirit. And their beliefs are asynchronous. That is, without time. No clear concept of past, present, and future. So we're already dealing. If your worldview rests upon these two things, you're already on a different planet than kind of a Western secular view of looking and understanding the world. So I found this breakdown, which is it's as helpful as it is as you find it. So Dreamtime may refer to an era before time during which the present world was formed, a kind of a spiritual realm era outside of the construct of time, which most of the creation stories from the Aboriginal peoples come from. Number two is what I take to be the better one, although I'm certainly, you could say, it's a mix of both. An alternate reality where varied versions of the living world exist eternally. And so what has happened over the last century is you have Western scholars who become interested in Aboriginal peoples and their culture. They go into the outback. They want to record their stories. They want to write them down. Many of these tribal peoples don't even have an alphabet. And so you have these scholars learning the languages, transliterating them into English, translating them into other languages, and trying to get a grasp on these concepts. But like I said, the concept of Dreamtime, at the end of the day, it really evades any type of I think helpful Western category to unpack it. So I think the best we can say, it's a mystical way of kind of understanding the world and notions of time. Our past, present, and future are all wrapped up in Dreamtime or the dreaming. It pervades every aspect of an Aboriginal Australian's life. Everyone who has, again, by our categories, everyone who has lived, is living, and will live exist in the moment, in the dreaming. We come from spirit and we return to spirit. So there's the language of the Aboriginal peoples. They speak about, the world and the universe, the spiritual nature of the universe as just as tangible, if not more real, than what we can touch, taste, hear, and see in this realm. Again, so like I said, it's radically different than a Western concept of things. I found this chart. I'd show this not to explain Dreamtime, because I can't explain this chart. But this, take it for what it is. But I think what the takeaway from a chart like this is just to show that everything in Aboriginal culture, the human world, the sacred world, the physical world. Again, these are all just these are Western categories. Ceremonies, relationships, stories. How do you deal with law and punishment? Is all contained in this concept of the dreaming. There's nothing outside of this kind of mystical way of understanding the universe. As I think I've told you, my background is in is in the ancient Greeks and Romans, and so I will often go there as if I can find a comparative example of things that help, and in Plato's writings, I actually found there's his concept of what he called the forms. I think is not a bad corollary to this kind of thing. Again, you would think, Plato as a Greek philosopher, he's firmly rooted in the Western concept of things, but really, there's a lot in Plato's philosophy that really strikes me as more Eastern, more mystical than kind of logical categories. And so his concept of the forms is this idea that down here in the physical realm, we don't without the eyes of a philosopher, we don't really see things how they really are. And so the idea of the forms is Plato says, out there somewhere in the mystical realm, there's an ultimate form, a perfected form of everything that we see, do, and talk about, concepts that we have, and everything that we have in this physical world that we know about and see and touch and build and argue about is a kind of a lesser form of the ultimate form. It comes filtered down into the physical universe and becomes a reflection at best of the ultimate thing. So, for example, this is Plato would say, out there in the realm of the forms, there's some kind of ultimate form of a table, the perfect, unadulterated, untouchable table. But down here, in our physical realm, we look at a coffee table and we look at a dining table, and we can kind of tell the difference between them. But what Plato says is that as beautiful and as functional as these can be, they are just kind of pale reflections of ultimate tableness. And this could apply to you know um, uh, more abstract concepts like justice or truth. We have things like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Nuremberg trials after World War II, as forms of justice, but at the end of the day, they're kind of imperfect reflections or shadows of ultimate justice. Or there's an ultimate catness out there, and your house cat, be it Gulliver, Kellogg's, or Hoover, or whatever name your cat, is a reflection of that. And all of these stem ultimately filter back up to some kind of form of the good with a capital G. So maybe Dreamtime functions in that kind of way, that the Aboriginal people see that everything that they see around them is reflective of some kind of parallel in some kind of ultimate spiritual reality. There's another. Maybe some of you have encountered in your own studies Plato's myth of the allegory of the cave, and this idea that Plato talks about the massive humanity. Just imagine them as a someone chained at the bottom of the cave, and they're looking at the back wall here. And for the person in the cave, this is the reality. They don't know that they're slaves. They don't know that they're chained. This is just simply their reality. And they look at the back wall, and they see here like this vase. And so for this guy here, well, that's a vase. What else could it be? But if you really understand, if you kind of put on philosophical eyes, if you start to kind of really understand how things work and nature of the spirit and the divine, Plato talks in his story here. He says, well, if this guy only knew there's a fire up above him, and someone here is walking between the fire, and in the cartoon here it's got it balanced on his head, right, holding up an actual vase, and the light of the fire casts a shadow here. So what this guy thinks is an actual vase, if he really had be able to kind of lose his chains and look up over the edge here, he'd say, oh my gosh, there is an actual vase back here. So like this is like the form of the vase, and this is a vase as we understand it here down on earth. Ultimately the light that you want to see everything in. Plato's allegorical sun is the ultimate pure light of the good with a capital G. So you take that for what it's worth, and as much as that helps you kind of get down the path towards understanding Dreamtime. So more language here. So like I said, in the Aboriginal mind, each individual's ancestry, you belong to a tribe, exists as an eternal present, an ultimate kind of a coherent one, no concept of past, present, and future. All worldly knowledge is accumulated via one's ancestry, which it tends to be understood and represented through a particular totem symbol. And so one of the ways that tribal peoples differentiate themselves from each other is they will have a different totem symbol. And so they're often animals. Here you see a little piece of Aboriginal art on the right here. So Aboriginal person might say, well, I I belong to, or I have kangaroo dreaming, or shark dreaming, or honey ant dreaming. And that term speaks to a resonance with a particular tribe, with a particular ancestry, a particular slant on this larger kind of mystical idea of where I came from, where I am, where I'm going, but all of it together in a grand mystical understanding of the universe. All right. Some specifics here. We do know, from kind of Western studies of some of these tribal peoples. We know a bit about kind of particular ceremonies, rituals, and the like. I want to call attention to one, the Bora ceremony. Seems to be one shared by many Aboriginal tribes for young boys becoming men. Most cultures, secular or sacred, will often have rituals for crossing that threshold from adolescence to adulthood. I mean, graduating from high school is usually a very sacred, I should say, secular ceremony. But as you walk across that stage with your goofy costume on, and you grab that piece of paper, that's a threshold moment. You're crossing over. It's kind of a way for saying, I have passed this, and I am no longer that, but I am now this. This is something very deeply human. We have these ceremonies mark humanity from the earliest civilizations of humanity. And the Bora ceremony for the tribal peoples is a very common one. And so, still, there's a lot of it that we don't understand. It certainly involves learning the sacred lore, being fluent in the dances and the songs and the stories and the traditions of the tribe. It's sometimes associated with a particular kind of spirit or god, Bayame. So we see Aboriginal peoples can maybe leaning something closer to a kind of a polytheistic religion like the ancient Greeks, but it's again still very, very different. And so Bayame, a creator spirit, there's a story that some tribes say he created the first initiation site, so he's the founder of this rite. We know that this ceremony is often it involves pain. The young men are circumcised. The foreskin is cut off their genitalia. They are given a scar. They have a tooth removed, or maybe the top part of their pinky finger is removed. And so this idea that initiation has to cost you something, and again, this brings at least me back to kind of that notion of the hero's journey, is that the ceremony of the Bora is kind of a mini journey. The young man has to kind of run the gauntlet, has to prove himself, has to be tested in many ways, and it often involves being wounded. And so you'll forever carry that scar. You'll never get that tooth back. But by looking at you, people can say, "Oh, there's someone who's gone through the journey." So in the Bora ceremony, the boys, kind of the physical move that they make is they start in one stone circle on the ground. That's the public circle, the uninitiated circle, and they move ultimately when the journey is complete, when they've passed muster. They move to the initiated circle, where now they are welcomed to the tribe as men, as it were, and have all the full-fledged benefits of being part of the adult men in that tribe. There was a similar ritual described on page 51 and following from the Anthology, a text that I asked you to read. So this is very, very common. There's lots of rituals like this among tribal peoples in more organized religions, more kind of loosely organized religions. This is something I would just say is simply human. Some very old photographs from the early part of the 20th century, where we see, again, these are Western scholars who were allowed in and to photograph some of these things. Here we have, this seems to be a path of the Iwana. They notice the kind of the carvings in the ground here. They're very similar. They seem to reflect those geological reliefs on the side of Uluru on Ayers Rock. And in the ceremony, the young man has to kind of, just one part of the Bora ceremony, has to kind of walk this path. And while he's walking, the adult men in the tribes will kind of quote unquote attack him. They don't actually with spears and bow and arrows, but they'll threaten him. So there's kind of this element of danger as the man as the young boy has to face that danger, get past it, to get to the next part of the ceremony. So it's a journey. He's walking the path he's following the paths of his ancestors towards manhood. Here's another one where the young boy has to walk across what seems to be this human being made out of dirt underneath the arch made and held by the adult men in the tribe. And so here that maybe this represents, the ultimate ancestor or all their ancestors. And so you walk the path, you become one with your ancestors by walking on the body, through this threshold space of the arch. You are one person on one side, and you are another person on the other side. Here's an actual Bora circle. Very, very simple. Just a circle of rocks in a dirt place. Here's a more kind of hollowed out version of it. This is again a model from a museum, which shows the circle of the uninitiated, that you have to kind of leave. You have to kind of leave your mother, and become a man and walk the path to the next circle. Many of you who are again maybe familiar with some of aspects of Australian culture may have heard of the didgeridoo, this instrument here, this long kind of hollow instrument that makes kind of a kind of buzzing sound, is something that has long been synonymous with Aboriginal Indigenous culture, and it still is. It's today it's when you do see it, it's an instrument for entertainment, accompanied by the clap sticks here. You can see in this picture here you have a couple of Aboriginal men, but they're clearly part of something else. You can see the stage here. You can see a drum kit here. They're part of a performance, as it were. But this is a deeply ancient instrument, and long before it became kind of an instrument of entertainment, it was a deeply ceremonial and sacred instrument, over the last 1,000 years or so. So often accompanied by percussive clapsticks, provides kind of the beat, and this guy plays the didgeridoo as a lead instrument. It is in deep Aboriginal culture considered to be an exclusively masculine instrument. There is a taboo against women playing the didgeridoo. It might have something to do. You can make too much of these things, but it's thought that the didgeridoo, just by its shape, is a kind of a phallic symbol. Metaphorically associated with male genitalia, as it were, and so therefore it's associated with masculinity, and so men are the one who play the didgeridoo. But it's who knows how it developed over the 1,000 years, but you do not see Aboriginal women playing the didgeridoo. The last thing I want to talk about, again, with a reminder, I'm giving lots of things short shrift, and there's so many things that I'm leaving out here, just for the sake of time. The Tijurunga, which also is an important sacred artifact in the development or the path that young men take towards becoming part of the upper echelons in their tribal hierarchy. So the Tijurunga too is still something very mysterious. We don't fully understand what exactly this is and what exactly how it functions. But we know it refers to some sort of object of religious significance. It's usually some sort of sacred stone that you might see here. You often will see almost like this fingerprint pattern on it. Sometimes it's a piece of wood. But yeah, like I said, it like Dreamtime. It defies Western categories. It really does not is not easily pinned down, as it were. Yeah, here's another one down there. So what exactly is it? It's a physical totem for the group of the tribe it belongs to, represents a physical form of the deep knowledge and wisdom handed down from the ancestor spirits. We know that it has a function in some of these initiation ceremonies, and so some have seen it as that it's like the Tijurunga itself is almost kind of a roadmap of their sacred lore. It represents the stories and the songs and the traditions. Each circle on the Tijurunga represents a different aspect of their culture or the dreaming. And so once you possess this stone, it's almost like you hold the culture literally in your hand to some degree. And so to be given one by the tribe, to be granted one by the tribe, is a long and painful initiation rite. It's something that can take a lifetime to acquire. In some cultures, as I understand it, this is only the possession of someone in the tribe who is the keeper of the lore, a kind of a medicine man, a shaman, we might call him. But to possess one is to have reached a place of importance and influence within the tribe. And some like the didgeridoo too. Here's another Tijurunga here, a wooden one. You know the shape of it. Here too, it's thought that maybe it at the root of it lies some kind of phallic imagery. This again, metaphorically representation of kind of male genitalia. And this too, again, to the Western ear, it sounds silly. It sounds sexual, but again, this is something you find in cultures around the world. I would argue we still have it in our culture, and we don't even recognize it. But this idea that phallic imagery, the display of male genitalia in some kind of artistic or totemic form, there's a belief behind it that the display of that will ward off evil spirits, will purify a place, will cleanse a place, protect it, as it were. The Greeks did this. The Romans did this. You find this kind of thing in tribal beliefs in Africa, and so it's thought maybe the Tijurunga too is a kind of quote unquote obscene symbol, which would ward off something that would disrupt and disharmonize the tribal group. And so this is something that you want in the hands of your sacred medicine man, someone who's charged with protecting the tribe spiritually. All right, on that note, I leave you with this. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. And again, as always, let me know if you have questions. See ya.